On the morning of the 28th of July, 1862, a British officer walks out of the reeds on the northern shore of a lake and stops. He is 35 years old. He has been walking on and off for 4 years. He has buried men on this journey. He has been robbed by chiefs, delayed for months at a time, and told repeatedly that he will not be allowed to pass. In front of him, the lake is ending. The water at the rim gathers itself, narrows, and falls. Not far, perhaps 5 meters, but it falls across a lip of rock nearly 300 meters wide, and it does not stop falling, and it is going north. John Hanning Speke stands and watches it for a long time. He knows what he is looking at, or he believes he does. Somewhere beyond this rock, beyond the papyrus, beyond 1,000 miles of swamp and desert he has never seen, this water becomes the river that fed Egypt. The river that Herodotus asked about. The river that Caesar's generals were told could not be followed to its beginning. He writes in his journal that the problem of all ages has been solved. He names the falls after a man in London he wants to please. He turns for home. He has 2 years left to live. And the argument he thinks he has just ended is not going to end. Not in his lifetime, not in the century after it, not in some ways, now. Because the question he answered that morning was never really a question about geography. It was a question about beginnings, about where a thing can be said to start. And it is a strange, uncomfortable, very old question, and the country he was standing in has spent the last 160 years being asked to answer it, over and over, on other people's terms. This is Uganda, 52 million people, roughly the size of Britain. Sitting on the equator, on a high plateau, 1,000 meters above the sea, with the largest lake in Africa on one shoulder and a wall of glaciers on the other. It is a landlocked country. It touches no ocean. And yet almost everything about it is decided by water. Water is why the kingdoms grew here. Water is why the British came. Water is what the country was named for on the maps of men who never saw it. And water is the one thing Uganda has never been fully allowed to keep. There is a sign at Jinja on the eastern shore, a short drive from the capital. It is a modest sign. It reads, "The source of the River Nile." Boats leave from the jetty below it every hour, and the falls that the sign is talking about are not there. They have not been there since 1954. The town of Jinja sits where the plateau breaks. Behind it, the lake. Ahead of it, the river. The lake is called Victoria on almost every map printed in the last century and a half. The people who have fished it for 1,000 years call it something else. Nalubale, the home of the spirits. Remember that word, it comes back. The river that leaves here is called the Victoria Nile at first, and then the Albert Nile, and then the White Nile. And then, at Khartoum, it meets a river the color of wet clay coming down from the Ethiopian highlands, and the two of them braid together and become the Nile that everyone thinks of. 6,600 kilometers, 11 countries, the longest river on Earth by most measurements. And it begins here, in a country most people could not place on a map. At the outflow, the water is astonishingly clear. This is the thing visitors never expect. They arrive with the Nile in their heads as a brown, heavy, agricultural river, and what they find is water so clean you can see 3 meters down to the rocks. It is clear because it has been sitting in the lake. A lake nearly 69,000 square kilometers wide holds sediment the way a settling tank does. Everything heavy sinks. What leaves the lake a ginger is the top of it, filtered by patience. The mud comes later. The mud is Ethiopia's contribution, thousands of kilometers north. Fishermen work the outflow at dawn in narrow wooden boats, standing to pull nets, letting the current do the steering. Cormorants dry their wings on the rocks. Fish eagles hold the high branches on both banks, and their call is the sound of this entire region, a rising whistle that carries for a kilometer over open water. And below the boats, under 20 meters of dark water, is a waterfall. But before we go down there is the matter of what a river is. Ask a hydrologist where the Nile begins, and you will not get one answer. You will get an argument, conducted politely, over a very long period of time. Here is the problem. The Nile leaves Lake Victoria at Jinja. That much is not disputed. Water that passes this point ends up in the Mediterranean. But a lake is not a spring. Something fills it. Rivers pour into Lake Victoria from Kenya, from Tanzania, from Rwanda, from Burundi. The largest of them is the Kagera, which arrives from the southwest, carrying water that started as rain on hills 1,000 kilometers from here. Follow the Kagera up, and it splits, and splits again, and the longest of its threads climbs into the highlands of Burundi and ends at a small spring near a town called Ruvieronza, at the foot of a mountain, in a country that does not touch the Nile at any point on its journey north. By that measurement, the most distant source of the Nile is not in Uganda at all. And here is the second problem, which is stranger. Most of the water in Lake Victoria did not come from any river. It fell out of the sky, directly onto the lake, as rain. The lake is so vast that it makes its own weather. Moisture evaporates off the surface by day, climbs, cools, and comes back down at night as some of the most violent thunderstorms on the planet. Pilots avoid the airspace over the lake after dark. The lightning here is close to constant, visible from the shore as a flickering wall. So the lake is fed mostly by itself, and most of what it gains, it loses again, straight back into the air. Only a fraction of it, a small remainder, gathers at the north end and leaves through Jinja. Which means the Nile is not the child of a spring in Burundi, and it is not the child of a lake in Uganda. It is what is left over, the change in the pocket of an enormous atmospheric transaction that happens over this water every single day. Speke could not have known any of that. He had a compass, a boiling point thermometer, and a conviction. His partner did not believe him. Richard Francis Burton had led the expedition that brought Speke into the interior. They had gone in together, and they had suffered together. Burton had been carried on a stretcher. Speke had gone temporarily blind. When Speke walked north alone and came back saying he had found the source of the Nile, Burton asked him for his evidence, and Speke did not really have any. He had seen a lake. He had not walked its shoreline. He had not followed the river out. Burton said so in print for years. On the 15th of September 1864, the two men are scheduled to debate the question in public in the city of Bath, in front of the British Association. The day before, Speak goes out shooting on a relative's estate. He climbs a low stone wall with a loaded shotgun. The gun discharges into his chest. He is 43. The debate never happens. Burton, who is sitting in the hall when the news arrives, is said to have gone very quiet. There are people who believe it was an accident, which is the likeliest explanation, and people who have always believed it was not. The argument outlived both of them. It is still, in a technical sense, unresolved. What is not in doubt is what happened to the lake in the century that followed. Lake Victoria is not an old lake. Geologically, it is almost brand new. It has dried out completely at least 3 times, the last of them around 14,000 years ago, when this whole basin was grassland and you could have walked from Uganda to Tanzania across the bottom of it. When the water came back, it came back empty, and into that empty water swam a few small, unremarkable fish. What they did next is one of the fastest bursts of evolution ever recorded in a vertebrate. Within 14,000 years, those few fish had become more than 500 distinct species. Not variations, species. Fish that could no longer breed with one another. They divided the lake between them with an almost bureaucratic precision. One species specialized in eating snails and grew jaws like a nutcracker. One ate the scales off the flanks of other fish. One ate only insect larvae buried in mud. One waited for a mother fish to take her eggs into her mouth for safekeeping, then rammed her head to make her spit them out and ate the eggs. They are called haplochromine cichlids, and until about 1960, they were the most diverse group of freshwater fish on Earth, and almost every one of them lived only here. The people of the lake caught them, dried them in the sun, and ate them. They had done so for as long as anyone had lived on these shores. Sometime in the mid-1950s, officers of the Uganda Game and Fisheries Department made a decision. They wanted a bigger fish in the lake, something worth catching, something that would look impressive on a line and sell well in a market. So they took Nile perch from Lake Albert in the west, and they put them into the water above the falls. They did not announce it. There was no public authorization. There was a scientific debate going on at the time about whether it was a good idea, and the fisheries men did not wait for it to conclude. The records are thin, and deliberately so. The Nile perch is not a subtle animal. It grows to 2 meters. It weighs up to 200 kilograms. It has a mouth that opens like a suitcase, and it swallows prey whole, and it does it fast. The cichlids had spent 14,000 years perfecting the art of eating specific, difficult things in specific, difficult ways. They had never needed to be fast. By the 1980s, the perch had spread across the entire lake. By the 1990s, more than 200 species of cichlid were gone. Not reduced, gone. Extinct in the space of about 30 years. Scientists who study extinction call it the largest loss of vertebrate species ever witnessed by science while it was happening. Nobody watched it happen. There was a dictatorship on at the time. What followed was an economy. Nile perch fillets are white, boneless, mild, and they freeze well. Processing plants opened along the shore at Jinja and Entebbe. The fish went to Europe by air freight in refrigerated holds out of the same airport where it had been loaded that morning. The people who had fished the lake for 1,000 years could not dry the perch in the sun because the flesh is too oily and it rots. So they smoked it instead, and to smoke it they needed wood, and the shoreline trees came down. And the perch that were caught was sold. The parts that were left over, The frames, the heads, the skin came back to the fishing villages in trucks and were fried and eaten there. A lake that had fed its own people directly for millennia began exporting protein and importing what was left of it. But something is happening in the lake now that nobody predicted. Some of the cichlids came back. Not all of them. Most of them are gone permanently, and no amount of hope changes that. But when the perch population itself began to crash from overfishing in the 2000s, divers and researchers pulling nets in shallow, rocky water started finding species that had been written up as extinct. Fish nobody had seen since the 1980s, alive, breeding, in the gaps between rocks where a 2-meter predator cannot go. Some of them had changed. Populations that had been squeezed through a bottleneck of a few individuals came out the other side genetically strange, more distinct from their neighbors than they had been before. They did not survive because someone saved them. They survived because they were small, and the rocks were complicated, and the predator was too big to follow. There is another thing that comes out of this lake, and most people who see it for the first time think it is smoke. On still mornings, dark columns rise off the water. They can be hundreds of meters tall. They lean and drift and hold their shape like the smoke of a distant fire, and there is no fire. They are flies, lake flies, tiny midges, each one a few millimeters long, that spend most of their lives as larvae in the mud on the lake bottom, in water so poor in oxygen that almost nothing else can live down there. When the conditions are right, they all rise at once, millions of them, hundreds of millions. They do not bite. They have no mouths that work. They live for a few hours, they mate in the air above the water, and they fall back into it. And on the shores of the lake, people walk into the swarms with wet baskets and wide, flat pans and swing them through the air, and the flies stick. They are pressed into a dense cake, dark green and dried and cooked. It is called kungu. It has more protein by weight than most meat. The oldest food on this lake is the one nobody exports. "40 minutes west of the lakeshore, the land begins to rise into hills, and on top of the hills is a city. Kampala was built on 7 of them, and then it spread, and now it covers more than 20. From the air, it looks like a green city with buildings pushed up through it, because every ridge is roofed, and every valley between the ridges is still growing something. Nearly 2 million people live here. The country around them has a median age of 18. Half of Uganda has never known any government but the one it has now. The traffic is a living system. Boda-bodas, small motorcycles carrying 1 passenger or 3, or a mattress, or a live goat, flow through the gaps between cars in a continuous braided stream. There are hundreds of thousands of them. They are the only thing in the city that is never stationary. Markets fill the low ground. Owino, in the center, is a maze under corrugated iron where you can buy a shirt, a car part, a chicken, and a phone charger within 10 meters of one another, and where the light comes down in thin bars through gaps in the roof. But Kampala is not the oldest thing on these hills. On one of them, behind a fence, under a roof made entirely of grass, 4 kings are buried. The kingdom of Uganda is older than most of the nations in Europe. Its own accounts trace it back to the 14th century, and the archaeology suggests something organized was here well before that. It had a hereditary king, the Kabaka. It had a parliament, the Lukiko. It had a system of clans, more than 50 of them, each with a totem animal, each with hereditary duties, each with a claim on the king. It had roads. It had a standing army. It had a navy of war canoes on the lake, and it used them. When Speke walked into the court of Kabaka Mutesa I in 1862, he was not walking into a wilderness. He was walking into a state, and he was received the way a foreign envoy is received, which is to say, watched carefully. The building on that hill is called Muzibu Azala Mpanga. It was built in 1882 as Mutesa's palace, and when he died 2 years later, he was buried inside it, and after him, 3 more kings, and it stopped being a palace and became the thing it is now. It is one of the largest thatched structures on Earth, 23 meters high. There is no metal in the original. The frame is timber and reed, tied. The dome is built up from rings of woven speargrass, laid in concentric circles, and the rings are counted, and the count matters. Inside, the walls are hung with cloth. Not woven cloth, beaten cloth. It is called olubugo, and it is made from the inner bark of a fig tree, the mutuba. A strip of bark is cut from the trunk in a single, careful sheet during the wet season. The tree is then wrapped in banana leaves, and it does not die. It regrows its bark, and it can be harvested again the next year, and the next, for decades. The strip is soaked, and then it is beaten. Not once, for hours, with wooden mallets in sequence, from a coarse mallet to a fine one, on a hardwood log, by a craftsman of the Ngonge clan whose right to do this is inherited. Under the beating, the bark does not tear, it spreads. A strip the width of 2 hands becomes a sheet the width of a bed, soft as felt, the color of terracotta. The technique is older than weaving. It is one of the oldest ways human beings have ever found to make a cloth, and in Buganda, it never stopped. The tombs of the kings are behind a curtain of it. Only a few people are permitted past. What is on the other side is not described to visitors, and the guides do not pretend otherwise. They simply say that it is not for you, and they say it kindly. On the 16th of March, 2010, at 8:30 in the evening, the building caught fire. The grass went up the way grass goes up. There was nothing anyone could do. By morning, the largest thatched structure in Africa was a ring of ash and standing char, and the 4 kings were under it, and the bark cloth was gone. The cause has never been established. Remember the fire. We come back to it. Because this is the thing about Buganda that a visitor does not immediately see. It is a kingdom that has been abolished twice by governments with tanks, and it is still here, and the governments are not. In 1966, 4 years after independence, the Prime Minister of Uganda decided that the kingdom was a problem. He suspended the constitution. He gave the order, and the army went up the hill to the royal enclosure at Mengo, and they went in shooting. The Kabaka, Mutesa II, a man who had been educated at Cambridge and made a captain in the Grenadier Guards, went over the back wall of his own palace in a rainstorm. He got out of the country. He reached London. He died there 3 years later in a rented flat in Bermondsey at 45 years old. The officer who commanded the assault on the palace was named Idi Amin. 5 years later, he took the country. The 25th of January, 1971. The president is out of the country at a conference in Singapore. Amin's soldiers move on the capital before dawn. By morning, it is done. There are crowds in the street, and they are cheering, because the man he replaced had abolished the kingdoms and jailed his ministers, and anything looks like relief for a few weeks. What follows is 8 years. The killing begins almost immediately, and it begins inside the army, with the soldiers from the north whose loyalty is assumed to lie elsewhere. Then it moves outward. A body called the State Research Bureau is created, and it operates out of a building in the middle of the city, and people who are taken into it are not seen again. The estimates of the dead range from 100,000 to 500,000 people. The range is that wide because nobody was permitted to count. In August of 1972, Amin announces that God has spoken to him in a dream and that the Asian population of Uganda must leave. There are around 80,000 of them. Most are the descendants of laborers and traders brought from India by the British to build the railway that made the country governable. Some families have been here for 3 generations. 23,000 of them hold Ugandan citizenship. They are given 90 days. They may take £55 sterling, not more. The businesses, the houses, the sugar estates, the shops, the bank accounts, the cars are seized and handed to army officers. They leave through Entebbe Airport in queues with 1 suitcase each. Within a year, the shops in Kampala have nothing on the shelves. Within 3 years, the sugar industry has collapsed. Within 8 years, Amin has invaded Tanzania, lost, and fled to Saudi Arabia, where he lived comfortably for another 24 years and died in his bed. He was never tried. Not once. Not for any of it. The country he left had no functioning economy, no reliable electricity, and a generation of professionals who had either been killed or had gone. That was 1979. Everyone under the age of 47 in Uganda today was born after it. The kingdoms were restored in 1993, ceremonial now, no political power, and the current arrangement is not comfortable for anyone. But the son of the man who went over the wall in the rain was crowned on the same hill his father fled, and the drums that were played at the coronation were the drums that had been hidden in 1966, in villages, in roofs, under floors, by people who had been told the kingdom no longer existed and had quietly decided to wait. There is a swamp about an hour west of the airport on the northern shore of the lake, and it is where people go to stand very still. The Bamba is a papyrus wetland. The channels through it are narrow, and you go in a wooden canoe with a man poling from the stern, and he cuts the engine, if there was one, a long way out. Then you wait. What you are waiting for is a bird 1.5 meters tall, grey, with a beak that looks like a mistake. The shoebill is not related to anything you would guess. It is its own thing, an ancient lineage, and its beak is 30 centimeters of hooked bone with an edge like a knife, and it uses it to catch lungfish. Lungfish live in the parts of the swamp where the water has almost no oxygen. That is the whole trick. Nothing else can hunt there because nothing else can find prey in water like that. So the lungfish come up to gulp air at the surface, and that is the moment. The shoebill hunts by standing. It will hold a single position for an hour, 2 hours. It does not shift its weight. Photographers have watched a shoebill for an entire morning and recorded no movement at all. And then it collapses forward, the whole bird, wings and all, into the water, and comes up with the fish and a mouthful of vegetation, and it stands there and spits the weeds out one by one with a small sideways flick, and swallows. There are perhaps a few thousand left. They need papyrus, and papyrus swamp is being drained for rice. The men who pole the canoes at Mbamba used to be fishermen. Now they earn more from taking people to see the bird than they ever did from the lake, and so the swamp is worth more standing than drained, and it stands. That is not sentiment, that is arithmetic. It is the only argument that has ever worked. West of the lake, the country changes. The plateau tilts, the air cools, and the land folds itself into a range of hills so steep and so wet that the forest on them has never been cleared, because there was never a way to get the timber out. It is called Bwindi. In the local language, the full name means the place of darkness. It is one of the oldest forests in Africa. It has been continuously forested for at least 25,000 years, which means it survived the last ice age, when most of the tropical forest on this continent shrank back into fragments and died. Bwindi did not. It sat on a mountainside where the mist never lifted, and it held on, and the species that were trapped inside it stayed. There are more tree species per hectare here than almost anywhere else in East Africa. There are 350 kinds of bird, 200 kinds of butterfly, including the African giant swallowtail, a black and cream insect the width of a spread hand that flies slowly, high in the canopy gaps, as if it knows nothing is going to eat it. And in the deep folds of it, in family groups, there are around 450 mountain gorillas. There are only about 1,000 mountain gorillas left alive on Earth. Almost half of them are in this one forest. A silverback is a male who has crossed into adulthood, and the name is literal. The hair across his back turns from black to a hard, metallic gray. He can weigh 200 kilograms. He eats leaves, stems, bark, and pith, 16 kilograms of it a day, which is why he is enormous and also why he is calm. There is no reason to hurry when your food cannot run. He leads a group of females and their young, and he decides where they sleep, and he builds a fresh nest every night out of bent branches, and never sleeps in the same one twice. They were down to a few hundred animals in the 1980s. They are not a conservation success story in any comfortable sense. They are the survivors of a very specific bargain. In 1991, Bwindi became a national park. The gorillas were protected, and the people who had lived inside that forest for thousands of years were walked out of it. The Batwa were hunter-gatherers. The forest was not their scenery. It was their pharmacy, their food, their burial ground, and their religion. They were given no land in exchange, no compensation, no title to anything. They were put out at the edge of a park they were now forbidden to enter. In an agricultural landscape, they had no history of farming, and told that this was conservation. Their communities have not recovered. Many of them are landless still. Some of them work as porters, carrying the bags of the tourists who have come to see the animals that replaced them. Both things are true. The gorillas are alive. That is the price that was paid, and it was not paid by the people who decided it. Around the forest, the hills are terraced to the ridgelines, and the population density outside the boundary is among the highest in rural Africa, 350 people to the square kilometer. The forest edge is a hard line. You can stand with 1 foot on farmland and 1 foot in a 25,000-year-old rainforest, and there is nothing in between. Further north, at Kampala, the forest is flatter and taller, and it holds 13 species of primate, more than any comparable forest in East Africa. Chimpanzees hunt colobus monkeys in the canopy there, and they do it cooperatively, and they do it in silence, and when it is over, they scream for 20 minutes. To the east, the country climbs again into an old volcano. Mount Elgon has not erupted in millions of years, and it has been eroding ever since, and its crater is now one of the widest on Earth. Coffee grows on its flanks. The caves in its sides are visited at night by elephants who go inside in the dark and use their tusks to scrape salt out of the rock walls, and have done so for so long that they have excavated the caves themselves. And beyond it, in the northeast, the green stops. Karamoja is dry. It is a landscape of thorn, red dust, and long horizons, and the people there are herders, and the relationship between a Karamojong family and its cattle is not agricultural. It is the accounting system. Cattle are wealth, dowry, standing, and history, and they were raided back and forth across this plateau for centuries. The rest of Uganda calls this region backward. The rest of Uganda is generally wrong about it. What Karamoja has is a functioning strategy for surviving a place where the rain fails, and no one in a wetter district has ever had to invent one. Now follow the river. It leaves Jinja going north, wide and clear, and after 130 kilometers, it does something a river should not do. It disappears. Lake Kyoga is not really a lake. It is a flooded, shallow, papyrus-choked depression in the middle of the country, 3 or 4 meters deep in most places, so full of floating vegetation that the mats of it break loose and drift across the open water like islands, and they carry trees and animals and sometimes people. The Nile goes into that and takes a long time to come out. When it does, it turns west and it starts to fall. Karuma Falls is a staircase of rapids, and then, 30 kilometers on, the river reaches the escarpment. What happens there is the most violent thing water does in this country. The Victoria Nile at that point is around 50 meters wide and moving without hurry, and then the rock closes in.
7 meters.
The gap the river is forced through is about 7 meters across. Everything that was 50 meters wide is compressed into the width of a small room, and it drops 43 meters into a gorge, and the sound of it arrives before the sight of it does. It is not a roar. A roar has an end. This is a pressure that sits on your chest. The spray goes up 200 meters and hangs there, and the sun makes a rainbow in it that does not move, all day, every day, forever. It is called Murchison Falls, and it is not the tallest waterfall in Africa, and it is not the widest. It is the strongest. More water goes through a smaller hole here than at any other named falls on Earth. Below it, the river opens out and slows and turns brown with churned sediment, and on the banks, in the shallows, lie the crocodiles. Nile crocodiles here reach 5 meters. Some of the old ones exceed it. They are the largest reptile in Africa, and they have been in this river system, in essentially this shape, for millions of years, which is a way of saying that whatever they are doing has already been tested against every catastrophe this continent can produce. They lie below the falls because the falls do their hunting for them. Fish that come over the drop arrive stunned, tumbling, disoriented in the white water, and the crocodiles wait in the eddies at the edge and take them without moving more than a body length. A crocodile can go a year without eating. It has a 4-chambered heart like a bird, and it can shunt its own blood away from its lungs and hold itself on the bottom of the river for an hour. It buries its eggs in the sand of the bank and guards them for 3 months, and when the young hatch, they call from inside the shell, and she digs them out and carries them to the water in her mouth. The most feared animal on this river is also one of the few reptiles on Earth that takes care of its children. Downstream, the gorge opens and the river slides into Lake Albert on the floor of the rift, with the wall of the Congo standing on the far side. It leaves again at the northern end, under a different name, and it goes into South Sudan, and it does not come back. Everything Uganda does to this water, it does in about 600 kilometers, and then the water is somebody else's. Except that Lake Albert is not filled by the Nile alone. Another river comes into it from the south. It is called the Semliki, and it arrives out of the rift with a temperature that does not belong on the equator. Something up there is melting. But before the mountains, there is the north. Northern Uganda spent 2 decades as a place people were trying to leave. The conflict there emptied villages into camps and took children out of schools, and it went on so long that an entire generation grew up inside displacement, and the rest of the world, mostly, did not look. That ended. The camps closed. The north is quiet now, and it is poor, and it is rebuilding at the speed that rebuilding actually happens, which is slowly. And then, in August of 2016, the border opened and did not close. Across the frontier in South Sudan, the ceasefire collapsed. People came south on foot, in numbers that arrived faster than anyone could count them. Thousands a day, mostly women, mostly children. Uganda's response is the part of this story that almost nobody outside East Africa knows. They did not build a camp, they built a district. The land they were given, in Yumbe, was 250 square kilometers of rocky ground that the local Aringa community had never farmed because it was not worth farming. And every family that arrived was allocated a plot, not a tent, a plot, with permission to build on it, plant on it, and stay. Because in Uganda, a refugee may work, may farm, may move, may start a business and open a shop and send children to the local school, and many of them do. It is called Bidi Bidi. Within 4 months, it held more than 270,000 people, which made it for a while the largest refugee settlement on the planet. There was no water there. That was the whole reason the land was available. So they drilled boreholes, and then tanks, and then taps, and then later solar panels, and then a mini-grid, and then a barber and a welder, and a man ironing team badges onto shirts in a shop with a solar panel on the roof, and a market that stays open after dark because the streetlights work. Satellite images taken 2.5 years apart show a forest and then a city. Uganda now hosts around 1.5 to 2 million refugees. It is one of the largest refugee hosting countries on Earth, and it is not a wealthy country, and nobody made it do this. The people arriving had lost a country. They were given a plot of land and told to farm it. That is what was offered, and it is more than most of the world has ever offered anyone. Now the mountains. There is a range on the western border that the Greeks wrote about before anyone in Europe had seen it. Ptolemy called them the Mountains of the Moon, and he said the Nile was born there, and he said it in the 2nd century from Alexandria, and for 1700 years, everyone assumed he had made it up. He had not made it up. The Ruwenzori are not volcanoes. They are a block of the Earth's crust that was pushed straight upward when the rift tore open, and they rise from equatorial rainforest to 5,109 meters at Margarita Peak, and the 3rd highest point in Africa is 30 kilometers from the equator, and it is covered in ice. You climb up through zones: rainforest first, dripping, dark, full of monkeys and buttress roots, then bamboo, then a bog you cross by leaping from grass tussock to grass tussock, and if you miss, you go into the waste. Then the Afro-Alpine zone, which is the part that does not look like Earth. Groundsels grow 10 meters tall, with trunks and cabbage heads. Lobelias stand in columns like green candles. Everything is furred with moss and hung with lichen, and the mist comes and goes so fast that the mountain appears and disappears while you are looking at it. Ruwenzori red duikers, a small antelope found nowhere else, watch from the thickets and do not run. And then, above all of it, the glaciers. The Bakonzo people have lived on these slopes for as long as there has been anyone to ask. They gave the range its name, and the name means snow. In their cosmology, a god lives in the ice. His name is Kithasamba, and he governs fertility of the land and of people, and his gift to the valley is the meltwater, which comes down every year and always has. Since 1906, the Ruwenzori have lost more than 80% of their ice. The glaciers on Mount Baker are gone. The glaciers on Mount Speke are gone. What is left is on Mount Stanley, and between 2020 and 2024, the largest surviving ice field on it lost close to a third of its surface area in 4 years. Scientists who model this are no longer arguing about whether the ice of the Ruwenzori will disappear. They are arguing about whether it happens in the 2040s or sooner than that. A ranger named Alfred Masareka has spent his working life on this mountain. He is Bakonzo. He first climbed it at 10 years old on a school trip. He remembers snow falling where rain falls now. He measures what is left and files the numbers and goes back up and measures again. He is documenting the retreat of his own god. The meltwater from those glaciers feeds the streams that feed the Semliki, that feeds Lake Albert, and Lake Albert feeds the Nile, which means that some of the water in Egypt fell as snow on the equator, and the place where the Nile begins, on that measurement, is a sheet of ice about the size of a few city blocks, sitting on a peak in western Uganda, and it is going away in front of a man who is writing down its dimensions. Which brings us back to the rock at Jinja. In 1947, an English engineer named Charles Redvers Westlake wrote a report for the colonial administration of Uganda. He had looked at the outflow of the lake and at the low falls just downstream of it, and he had done the arithmetic, and his conclusion was simple. There was a great deal of energy going over that ledge, and it was being wasted. The falls he was talking about were the ones Speke had named. 5 meters high, nearly 300 meters wide, the whole outflow of the largest lake in Africa, tipping over a natural rock barrier day and night since the lake refilled. Westlake proposed a dam. The engineering was serious. 80,000 tons of material had to come in from a Europe that was still rationing food, by ship to Mombasa, and then 1,200 kilometers inland by rail. 36,000 tons of it was cement. They built it in 3 years. It came in ahead of schedule. In 1954, Queen Elizabeth II stood at Jinja and opened the Owen Falls Dam, and behind her, the water rose, and it kept rising, and it went over the top of the rock ledge, and it covered it. Ripon Falls stopped existing that year. Not eroded, not diverted, drowned, deliberately, by a decision, in the space of a few weeks. The place that Speke had crossed a continent to reach, the place he had named after a man in London, the place that a monument now points at, the place on the sign that says, "Source of the River Nile," is 20 meters underwater, and has been for longer than most Ugandans have been alive. But that is not the strange part. The strange part is what Uganda agreed to in exchange. In 1929 and again in 1949, agreements were signed between Britain acting for its colonies, and Egypt. Egypt's position was, and had always been, unambiguous. Egypt has almost no rainfall. Egypt is the Nile. Anything done upstream that changes the volume of water arriving at Aswan is, from Cairo's point of view, an existential act. So the dam at Jinja was permitted on one condition. It was not allowed to change the flow. Whatever volume of water the natural rock ledge would have released in a given month, at a given lake level, the dam must release. Exactly that. No more, no less. They worked out the relationship mathematically and drew it as a line on a graph, and the line was written into the agreement. It is called the agreed curve. So consider what that means, standing on the dam wall. Uganda destroyed a waterfall, and then Uganda was bound by treaty to operate the machine that destroyed it in such a way that the river downstream would never notice the difference. The turbines at Jinja are, in the most literal sense, an impersonation. Every day, the operators open and close the sluices to make the Nile behave as though the falls were still there. For 70 years, this country has been simulating a waterfall it is not allowed to have back. And the water has not always cooperated. When the lake rose in the last decade, shorelines flooded in Uganda and in Kenya and in Tanzania, and villages went under, and the argument about how much water Jinja should be letting out and who has the right to decide became a diplomatic problem with 4 capitals in it. The falls used to make that decision. The falls did not need a committee. The dam was renamed eventually. It is not the Owen Falls Dam anymore. It is Nalubale, the home of the spirits, the old name of the lake, the name that was here before the queen the lake is named after was born. Downstream in 2011, they did it again. Ujagali Falls was a set of rapids about 10 kilometers below Jinja. It was white water, and rafting companies ran it, and it was also a shrine. The spirits of the Basoga were understood to live in that water, and there were people whose hereditary role was to speak to them there. A dam was built. 250 megawatts. The falls are under the reservoir now. There was a ceremony before the flooding to move the spirits to another stretch of the river. It was performed properly. It cost money, and the money was paid. Uganda has electricity. Uganda needed electricity. Both of those sentences are true, and the falls are still gone. So where does the Nile truly begin? Not at the sign, because the thing the sign is pointing at is submerged. Not at the lake, because the lake is mostly rain, and the rain is mostly the lake. Not in Burundi, at the spring, because that thread of water is a rumor by the time it reaches here. Not on the glacier, though the glacier is in it, and the glacier is leaving. Here is where it begins. It begins at a set of sluice gates on a concrete wall in eastern Uganda, where a group of engineers every single day decide how much of this country's water is allowed to go north. That is not a poetic answer. That is the operating reality of the longest river on Earth. Its beginning is not a place, it is a permission, and it is granted every day by a country that agreed a very long time ago, under someone else's flag, to give the water away exactly as fast as it always had. On the hill in Kampala, they rebuilt the tomb.
It took 14 years.
The old craftsman who had worked on the roof decades earlier came back and taught the rings of woven grass to men who had not been born when the building last needed them. The right palm fronds were found, the right timber, the bark cloth was beaten again, by hand, by the clan whose job it is, from the bark of trees that grew back after being stripped. It reopened. The kings are covered again. and in the shallow rocks of the lake, in gaps a large fish cannot enter, there are small striped cichlids that the scientific literature had already finished writing about. Nothing here was saved by being important. The kingdom was not spared because it was old. The fish did not survive because they were unique. The forest at Bwindi was not preserved by anyone's affection for it. They are still here because of specific, unglamorous facts. The grass could be woven again by someone who remembered how. The rocks were too small for the predator. The hillside was too steep to log. Uganda is a country that has been told repeatedly and by outsiders what it is the source of. The source of the Nile, the source of a dictator, the Pearl of Africa, which was a phrase written by a British politician who visited for 2 weeks. None of those descriptions came from here. The water leaves anyway. It has left every day for 14,000 years, and it will leave tomorrow, whatever is decided about it, and in 90 days, some of it will be standing in a canal in the Nile Delta, watering a field 4,000 miles from the rock it went over. Perhaps a river does not have a beginning at all. Perhaps it only has a place where we decided to stop asking, and a country that has to live at that place and answer for it and keep the gates open. Thanks for watching. Until the next journey,